Our journey in chemistry will demand us to know how to name molecular and ionic compounds. So in this video, we'll look at the tactics or the skills you need for you to name ionic and molecular compounds. Enjoy the video. Let us start by learning how to name molecular compounds. So for us to know how to name molecular compounds, we first need to understand what molecular compounds are. So basically, molecular compounds, these are compounds that are formed from non-metal atoms. So if you have two non-metal atoms bonding, they form a compound. That compound is a molecular compound. So what are the rules, or what do we do to name molecular compounds? Well, we have this statement here. This statement basically helps us to know how to name molecular compounds. So when it comes to naming molecular compounds, you first start with the prefix of the first atom, then followed by the name of that atom. After that, you go to the next atom, you write the prefix of the second atom, then followed by the name of that atom. So the second atom, it changes its name. You need to add IDE to the second atom. So what are the prefixes which we are talking about? Here is the list of the prefixes from number 1 to number 10. So if you have one carbon, instead of saying one carbon, you will say mono. If you have two carbons, you'll say di, 3 tetra. So this is the table of the prefixes. Now, we need to note what we have said here. We are saying if the first atom is 1, there is no need of putting mono. If the first atom is 1, there is no need of putting mono. So let's give an example of this statement. If you have this molecular compound, so when it comes to naming this molecular compound, you know that there is carbon, there is also oxygen. So if you get these two compounds, so the first one, the rule is saying we need to put the prefix, but it is being guided to say if the first atom is 1, let us not put the word mono. So we won't say monocarbon. So we'll just put carbon. Then, how many oxygens do we have? We have 2 oxygens. So 2 is di. So then the oxygen will change to oxide. So it will be carbon dioxide. Okay, so let's practice these rules. So let us look at this example. We have N2O5. So what name can we give this molecular compound? So we have seen that this compound has nitrogen and oxygen. So how many nitrogens are there? There are 2. So it will start with di. So after writing di, we'll put nitrogen, dinitrogen. Then we go to the next compound. How many oxygens are there? There are 5. So if there are 5 oxygens, we'll use pent. So then oxygen will change to oxide. So oxide. So the final name will be dinitrogen pentoxide. So this is the name for N2O5. at your own free time, you can try to name SF6, also SO3, and N2O4. You'll find if you apply these rules we have discussed, this work will be more interesting. So let's look at the second type of compounds, that is ionic compounds, and see how we name ionic compounds. The second type of compounds we want to look at how we name them is the ionic compounds. Now, how do you know that this is an ionic compound? Basically, an ionic compound involves a positive metal ion reacting with a negative non-metal ion. So when these two ions, they come together, they form the ionic compound. So let's look at some of the ionic compounds and how we name them. So we'll start with the first compounds that involves monoatomic ions. So what are monoatomic ions? Monoatomic ions are simply single atom ions. So if you only have one atom and this atom has gained a charge and becomes an ion, that forms a monoatomic ion. So we can have the example of sodium. We know that sodium has 11 electrons. So if it has 11 electrons, it simply means it loses one electron. So if it loses one electron, it becomes sodium with a positive charge. So if this is what happens to sodium, this sodium becomes a positive metal ion. So it is a monoatomic ion of sodium. So we have this table of common monoatomic ions. So those ions that are in group 1, they form a positive 1 ion. And those atoms that are in group 2, they form positive 2 ions. Then atoms that are in group 13, like aluminium specifically, it forms a positive 3 ion. Then we'll look at those that are non-metals, that is from group 15 to group 17. So those atoms that are in group 15, they form a negative 3 ion. Then those that are in group 16, they form a negative 2 ion. Then those in group 17, they form a negative 1 ion. So these from negative, or rather from group 15 to group 17, they are non-metals. So wherever a metal forms a bond with this non-metal, they form an ionic compound. So if a non-metal is in that compound, that non-metal will end with IDE. So let's now practice how we name these compounds after we have known the monoatomic ions and some of the charges they make. Take this example of monoatomic ions in a compound. So we have calcium bromide. Then we are asked to write its chemical formula. What are we going to do if we want to write the chemical formula for calcium bromide? So these are monoatomic ions which are involved here. So what is the monoatomic ion for calcium? The symbol for calcium is Ca. Then the symbol for bromine is Br. The charge for calcium is positive 2. Then the charge for bromine is a negative. So after you reach this point, the charges, they'll crisscross. So if they crisscross the charges, you have calcium, then bromine will get the charge 2. So this becomes the chemical formula for calcium bromide. Let's do another example. So the other example we have is for potassium chloride. So we know that the symbol for potassium is K, then the symbol for chlorine is Cl. The charge for potassium is positive, then the charge for chlorine is negative. So these charges, they'll crisscross, then you have KCl. So this becomes the symbol or the chemical formula for potassium chloride. In some cases, you can be given the chemical formula, then they ask you to write its name. So like here, we have this atom and this atom, then we are asked to give us its name. So basically, when we are giving the name, we start with the cation, which is the positive ion, then the anion. So what is the name for the cation? So the positive ion here was sodium plus, then the negative ion was chlorine. So after you identify these two, you know that the first will be sodium, then chlorine will change, will add IDE to its name, so it will become chloride. So we have named this compound, it will be sodium chloride. So basically, you need to know that you start with the cation, then name the ion. Other monoatomic ions, we can look at where the same metal forms 2 or 3 different ions. So how do we name such compounds? We have an example of ion. Ion can form ion 2 or ion 3. So how do you name compounds involving these metals? So basically, in this video, we'll look at the stock system of naming these compounds. So we have the stock system and the classical system. So I'm not going to talk about the classical system, because the classical system, you look at how we name these names, usually using Latin. So we'll just focus on the stock system. So if it is ion 2, you write it as ion, then open bracket, you put 2. Then if it is ion 3, you write it as ion, open bracket, you put 3, then indicate that. So if these are the 2 transition ions which we have looked at, you can write them in this way. So let's see an example on how you can write a compound involving these transition metals. So let's write the formulas for these 2 transition metals. So the first one, we have ion 2 oxide, and the other one ion 3 oxide. So if you have a transition metal like this one, the number just tells you the charge of the transition metal involved. So in the first one, we have ion, so their ion will be of positive 2. Then the oxide, we know that the oxide has the charge of negative 2. So if these they crisscross, you have Fe2O2. So after you have this, you need to reduce it to the simplest form. So 2 can be simplified, and these 2 can be simplified. 2 into 2 is 1. So you have FeO. So this is iron 2 oxide. Let's look at iron 3 oxide. So here iron will have a charge of 3, then oxygen will have a charge of -2. So if they crisscross, you have iron will get 2, then oxygen will get 3. So this is iron 3 oxide. So let's give some work which you can practice. At your own free time, you can try to write copper 1 oxide and copper 2 oxide. Then you'll see how interesting these are when you follow the laws we have just mentioned. First kind of ions we are looking at in this video is the polyatomic ions. So how do you write a name, or how do you know when a polyatomic ion is in your question? So what are polyatomic ions basically? So this is where 2 or more atoms group together and they form one single unit of charge. So take for instance, you can have this. So this is a polyatomic atom, or ion rather. So this has a single charge of negative. Then we have another polyatomic ion which has a single charge of -4. Then even this polyatomic ion which has a single charge of +1. So when it comes to naming these polyatomic ions, you need to master their names. So the first one, this one, its name is a nitrate ion. Then this one is, the second one is a phosphate ion. Then this one is the ammonium ion. So you need really to know these and more ions. If you master them, then you can easily write a name that involves polyatomic ions. So let's see some examples of compounds involving polyatomic ions. Let us look at this example that involves a polyatomic ion and a monoatomic ion. So we have sodium, which is a monoatomic ion, and we know that its charge is positive. Then a sulfate, you write it as SO4 2 negative. So after you know that a sulfate is SO4 2 negative, you crisscross the charges, so it will be Na2SO4. Because sodium has a charge of 1, you just write SO4. So this is sodium sulfate. Let us look at another example that is of iron 3 sulfate. So here iron, it is a transition metal, so it will have a +3. Then a sulfate, SO4, -2. So you crisscross the charges. So iron will have a 2. Then a sulfate, you open bracket SO4 close bracket 3. So it will get the charge for iron there. So this becomes iron 3 sulfate. As a summary of this video, try to answer the name or you give the formula of the compounds listed below. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Cropas Zulu, and like the Facebook page Zuluba Consultants for this and more videos.